Our second reading today is from the Gospel according to Mark chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. They came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. And may God speak to us through these verses today. Minister and author Fred Craddock tells a story about when he was a very young man. World War II was going on. Times were very tough. The whole country was worried about the war. And Fred worked in a factory. One day, he and his friends went out for lunch, and on their way, they passed a blind man on the sidewalk. He was playing a guitar for money, and he had this sign that said, "I'm blind, please help me." Well, Fred and his other young friends decided to play a trick or prank on the blind man. They had nails from the factory. They dropped nails in his cup, made the blind man think they'd given him some coins. So the blind man said to them, "Thank you very much. God bless you." He was so grateful. But a little bit later, what they had done to the blind man began to bother Fred. He felt guilty. How could they have been so cruel? On top of that, Fred had recently become a Christian, and he started thinking about all the ugly, terrible things that people do to each other. So he decided to go to his minister, and he told him about this trick they played on the blind man. This minister listened, and then he sat up very sternly and said, "Are you aware that this country is in the biggest war of its history? People are dying by the hundreds every day. Soldiers have been away from their families for years, and you're worried about putting nails in a blind man's cup?" Apparently, that minister thought God was too busy to be bothered about something so trivial as the blind man or Fred's feelings about it. Now, I'm reminded of this story because of what's happening in our gospel reading today. Jesus is leaving a big city followed by a big crowd, and by the roadside is a blind beggar named Bartimaeus. And it was common for people with challenges and disabilities to beg along the busy roads in and out of these cities where they could count on some heavy traffic. And remember, there were no welfare systems or health plans for the disabled back then. Their only hope was begging. Now, Bartimaeus hears that Jesus is passing by and he calls out for help. "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Then a bunch of people yell at Bartimaeus to shut up and leave Jesus alone. For some reason, those people seem to think they kind of have exclusive rights to Jesus. They need to keep the wrong kind of people away from him. Maybe they think Bartimaeus is too unpleasant, or too different, or too sinful, or just too unimportant to bother with. Bartimaeus is a homeless beggar on a busy street that no one really notices as the crowd hurries to work or while they're out shopping. We've seen him. Maybe we do notice him, but we do prefer to avert our eyes or maybe cross the street to avoid having to deal with him. His cry for help gets lost in the hustle and bustle of our busy lives. And maybe we want him to be quiet. We don't want this sort of thing in our neighborhoods. We want the police or the mayor or somebody to take care of such things. We don't want our property values to go down. We want to walk our streets without having to look at something like that. He's ugly and depressing. Anybody ever seen the news story about some cities that are putting spiked sidewalks where the homeless people have often tried to sleep? We don't want that. True story. Look it up. Maybe we don't want them in our churches either. We want our churches to be clean and neat and orderly, filled with people who dress well, who are like us, know how to behave. Bartimaeus can come to symbolize all the people we wish would just shut up and not bother us with their problems and their needs. And yet, Bartimaeus only cries out louder, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now Jesus hears him, and he stops. He turns his attention to Bartimaeus, and he lets him know that no matter that crowd, no matter what might be going on, no matter where Jesus might be going, Bartimaeus matters. Bartimaeus deserves attention and respect. Bring him to me, says Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I find it kind of funny what happens next. This crowd that was yelling at Bartimaeus to shut up and stay away, but as soon as Jesus asks for him, well, they just swarm all over Bartimaeus. They're all hugs and smiles now. Take heart, Bartimaeus. Come on, he's calling you. Well, maybe the crowd is just fickle. Crowds are fickle. Or maybe they just needed Jesus to explain things a little better to them, to show them what following him is really all about. They just need Jesus to open their eyes a little bit, which is ironic because it's Bartimaeus who wants his eyes opened and he gets them opened. My teacher, he says, I want to see. Bartimaeus wants his vision restored. Not only would he be able to see again, but he would no longer have to beg for a living. He would no longer be shut out. He wouldn't be ostracized by the rest of society. He would be restored to the community. He'd be human again and treated that way. And that, my friends, would be the greater healing, because then his whole person, his whole life would be healed. Your faith has healed you, says Jesus. And out of joy and gratitude, Bartimaeus starts to follow Jesus. Now, all through the Gospels, there is a contrast made between people with a physical blindness and people with spiritual blindness. Jesus often speaks of people who have two good eyes, but they're spiritually blind. They can't see or not willing to see God's truth. In the gospel stories, it is often those who are physically blind who have a deeper and truer sense of who Jesus really is. They seem to see him more clearly than the so-called experts with good eyes, like the religious leaders. Even Jesus' closest friends and disciples frequently have spiritual blindness that prevents them from seeing who he really is and what he's really up to. And it's a similar situation here. This crowd somehow gets it in their heads that Jesus is too important or too holy to bother with someone like Bartimaeus. But it turns out that they are the ones who think they're too holy or too important to bother with him. Because Jesus is the one who always stops and makes time. It is Jesus who says, bring them to me. And what Jesus reveals is their own blindness. They're blind to what it means to follow him, and they are blind to the needs of other human beings like Bartimaeus. And so we might say that Bartimaeus stands here in our gospel reading as a kind of symbol, a symbol of everyone who gets marginalized by society, the ones who get pushed away or who fall through the cracks. He's the outsider that we turn into an outcast. He is those of us who has lost control of our lives because we don't have a say, we don't have a voice. He's everyone who cries out for mercy and kindness and love, but gets ignored or told to be quiet and go away. He is the victims of our prejudice and our discrimination. He is the nations and the races of people who are crushed by poverty and ravaged by disease, who beg for the scraps that the big rich countries toss to them. Bartimaeus is also everyone who believes that Jesus came to heal the world of all those wrongs, all that spiritual blindness. He's everyone who believes that even though they may be rejected by Jesus' followers, they won't be rejected by Jesus. And so they cry out even louder. They cry out above the voices of rejection, for Jesus himself, have mercy on me. Now, my friends, we all need Jesus to open our eyes a bit more. After all, it was not so long ago that the church approved the persecution of Jews, the slave trade of blacks, the oppression of women, all of these based on beliefs that those groups were somehow inferior and didn't deserve the same rights or dignity. And unfortunately, even today in many churches, we will still find racism, sexism, and other prejudices. And there are still people crying out for the mercy of Jesus that we may be ignoring or telling to be quiet and go away. People who are rejected in some misguided attempt to protect Jesus from them. And the truth is, we're only trying to protect ourselves from them. Because Jesus is the one who always says, bring them to me, let them come to me. Bartimaeus said to Jesus, my teacher, I want to see. And maybe that should be our prayer, our request as well, for Jesus to help us truly see, to let him open our eyes so that we can see more the way he sees. And that starts by letting him open our hearts a little bit more, as our song played. Because Jesus' kind of vision can only come from the heart. Helen Keller, the writer and activist who lost her sight as a child, was once asked, isn't it a tragedy to be blind? And she replied, no, I would rather be blind and be able to see with the heart than have two good eyes and see nothing. My friends, Jesus comes to expose the spiritual blindness that we all have now and then. He doesn't do it to make us feel bad. He doesn't do it to make us feel stupid. He does it so that we can come to him to be healed. He comes to reveal that the cure for our blindness, the cure for all the suffering that we cause each other, is compassionate love, caring and sharing with each other. It is love that can open our eyes to see beyond our differences to our common humanity. It is love that can right all the wrongs that we do to each other. It is love that enables us to forgive and bring healing to others. And it is through love that we find forgiveness and healing for ourselves. You might remember the story I mentioned about young Fred Craddock and the trick he played on that blind man. After his rather discouraging meeting with that minister, who couldn't be bothered, Fred went to his youth minister. And she agreed that he had done a terrible thing, but she had an answer for him. God forgives you, she said, but why don't you go find that blind man and tell him what you did and ask for his forgiveness? And if you have some money, give it to him. I did that, says Fred, and that poor man forgave me. And he smiled and said, I know how it is. Lots of boys are full of mischief, aren't they? But he forgave me. If we had been watching from across the street, we might have seen nothing more than an awkward young man and a blind beggar. But if we opened our eyes a bit more and looked closer, we would have seen two people sharing the forgiveness and the love and the grace of Jesus Christ. Two people who became a little more human to each other. Two people who shared a moment of healing. And it's a kind of healing that we can all have. Amen.